What did Donald Trump do today? April 16, 2025 recap. Donald Trump's Truth Social post is a prime example of incendiary rhetoric designed to inflame rather than inform. It distorts legal reality, undermines the judiciary, and spreads misleading claims about immigration policy under President Biden. His language, 530,000 illegal migrants, Joe Biden flew over the border, and radicalized judge, is not only factually unsupported but also laced with conspiratorial framing intended to stoke fear and resentment. First, Trump falsely implies that the Biden administration flew over 500,000 undocumented immigrants into the country in one day, an absurd logistical impossibility and a gross misrepresentation of any known immigration program. No such program has been documented to function in this way, and the hyperbolic figure appears intended solely to provoke outrage rather than reflect policy reality. Second, his criticism of the judge's ruling ignores basic principles of due process. Immigration law, like all areas of U.S. jurisprudence, recognizes that individuals are entitled to individual review of their claims, especially in matters involving asylum, deportation, or legal status. Group deportations without individualized hearings would constitute a fundamental violation of both domestic law and international human rights obligations. Trump's frustration with this foundational legal norm reveals a disregard for constitutional protections and procedural fairness. Third, his claim that the courts are totally out of control and motivated by personal animus against him, they seem to hate Trump so much, is a reckless attack on judicial independence. It suggests that legal setbacks are not due to the merits of the case but to political bias, an accusation offered without evidence. This is a common theme in Trump's messaging: delegitimize the court when it rules against him and praise it when it does not. Finally, his appeal to common sense is hollow. There is nothing commonsensical about sidestepping legal due process for political expediency. The implication that constitutional rights should be suspended to fast-track mass deportations is authoritarian in tone and policy. In short, the post is not just misleading, it's dangerous. It undermines legal norms, spreads misinformation, and continues Trump's broader pattern of casting democratic institutions as enemies when they do not serve his agenda. Source: Truth Social. Donald Trump signed an executive order titled Ensuring Commercial Cost-Effective Solutions in Federal Contracts, which purports to eliminate wasteful government spending by mandating greater reliance on commercially available products and services. While the order is framed as a measure to enhance fiscal responsibility and leverage private sector innovation, it leans heavily on politicized language and oversimplified assumptions. The preamble casts blame on previous administrations for evading statutory preferences and abusing federal contracting processes, setting a tone that is more accusatory than constructive. This politicized framing overlooks the reality that many government missions, especially in defense, cybersecurity, and emergency response, require specialized, non-commercial solutions that cannot be adequately sourced from the private market. Despite its rhetorical commitment to efficiency, the order imposes layers of bureaucracy that may have the opposite effect. It requires contracting officers to submit detailed justifications and obtain high-level approval for any procurement involving non-commercial products or services, even in areas where such customization is indispensable. This process introduces delays and administrative burden in the name of streamlining, particularly as agencies will be required to report annually to the Office of Management and Budget (OMB) on compliance. Moreover, the order expands centralized oversight by giving the OMB discretionary power to weigh in on individual procurement decisions, a move that risks politicizing what should be technical and mission-driven determinations. This encroachment on agency discretion undermines the role of career procurement professionals and suggests a broader effort to control federal operations from the executive branch. The order also reflects a blind faith in commercial off-the-shelf COTS solutions, implying that private industry can readily meet government needs across the board. In practice, many federal requirements, ranging from nuclear facility management to custom-built defense systems, cannot be met through commercial means. Prioritizing COTS procurement over fit-for-purpose solutions could result in the adoption of inferior or ill-suited technologies, potentially compromising performance, security, and long-term value. Finally, the executive order contains only the most generic legal disclaimers, offering little in the way of procedural safeguards for agencies that may face undue interference. There is no outlined appeals process if an acquisition request is rejected on political or ideological grounds. Instead of empowering agencies to improve procurement practices, the order introduces a top-down, ideologically charged approach that prioritizes optics over effectiveness. In sum, while the stated goals of reducing waste and enhancing efficiency are worthy, the execution reflects a heavy-handed, politically motivated directive that may obstruct rather than improve the federal acquisition system. White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt delivered a press briefing alongside grieving mother Patty Morin in a troubling display of political exploitation disguised as governance. Leavitt opened with inflammatory rhetoric, casting the deportation case of Kilmar Abrego Garcia as evidence of Democratic betrayal, falsely accusing Senator Chris Van Hollen of using taxpayer funds to advocate for the release of a so-called foreign terrorist. This claim distorted both the senator's actions and the context surrounding Garcia's case, which involves an admitted deportation error by the Department of Justice. Labeling Garcia a terrorist without a legal designation or federal conviction for terrorism is dangerously irresponsible, blurring the lines between alleged gang affiliation and acts of international terrorism, and undermining the principle of due process. Leavitt went further by describing Garcia in terms designed to evoke fear and anger, repeatedly emphasizing his status as an illegal alien, and invoking gang symbolism in a way that framed the entire issue as a moral battle between law-abiding Americans and a shadowy foreign criminal underclass. This narrative was used to condemn the Democratic Party wholesale, accusing them of defending rapists, murderers, and terrorists, a guilt by association tactic that is both inflammatory and devoid of policy nuance. Meanwhile, data points such as historic lows in border crossings were referenced without evidence, and claims about the Supreme Court's ruling on presidential authority were vague and legally misleading, falsely implying that the President and Secretary of State are immune from judicial oversight in deportation matters. Patty Morin's presence and testimony were the emotional centerpiece of the event. Her grief is undeniable, and her recounting of the horrific murder of her daughter Rachel was raw and painful. However, the graphic nature of her testimony, presented in exhaustive detail at a press briefing rather than in a more appropriate venue, raises ethical concerns. The administration's decision to include her story in this format, unmoderated and saturated with forensic specifics, reads less like a solemn call to action and more like an emotional appeal crafted to reinforce a hardline immigration agenda. While Morin's anguish is genuine and deeply moving, her story was framed in a way that served a political purpose: to justify President Trump's immigration crackdowns and to vilify those calling for caution, legality, or accountability in the deportation process. This briefing was not a serious engagement with policy, law, or justice. It was a political performance aimed at stoking public outrage. It subordinated factual clarity to emotional theater, weaponized personal grief to deflect from due process violations, and blurred the line between governance and campaigning. By presenting the brutal actions of one individual as representative of an entire population and invoking a victim's tragedy to justify sweeping, punitive policy, the administration revealed more about its political priorities than its commitment to lawful, ethical leadership. Donald Trump's participation in the Easter prayer service and dinner blended religious ceremony with political spectacle in a way that undermined the solemnity of the occasion. What began with reverent prayer, scripture, and musical tributes to Christian doctrine quickly transformed into a campaign-style event that centered on Trump's personal narrative and political agenda. The transition from reflections on the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ to proclamations about military spending, educational reform, and bans on transgender athletes in sports struck a jarring tone. Rather than preserving the spiritual integrity of Easter, the most sacred time in the Christian calendar, the event leveraged religious language to reinforce partisan messaging. Throughout the evening, Trump repeatedly personalized the occasion, drawing attention to his electoral performance, crowd sizes, and administrative victories. His self-congratulatory tone clashed with the humility traditionally expected in religious observance. This personalization, coupled with digressions into anecdotes and political grievances, diluted the focus on sacrifice and the theme of resurrection. Trump's interjections often simplified or politicized matters of faith, for instance, asserting as federal policy that God created two genders. Such declarations oversimplify complex theological and social discussions and risk alienating those outside a narrowly defined worldview. Further, the rhetorical discipline of the event suffered from redundancy and unfocused commentary. What could have been a dignified national moment was interrupted by meandering remarks and casual references to personal loyalty. Religious leaders at the event frequently elevated Trump's role in exaggerated spiritual terms, with one even suggesting divine protection from harm. While clearly intended to show gratitude, these remarks contributed to a troubling dynamic: the elevation of a political figure within a religious context that bordered on the cult of personality. In a nation built on the separation of church and state, this blending of devotion and partisanship raises serious concerns about the integrity of both governance and worship. Although the Easter event included moments of genuine reverence, its spiritual purpose was largely eclipsed by political messaging and personal glorification. The service became less about honoring the Christian ideal of resurrection and more about reinforcing the president's image among a loyal base. This convergence of faith and politics did not foster national unity or reflection. Rather, it exposed the growing use of religious ceremony as a vehicle for ideological branding and personal affirmation. Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. held his first press conference on the latest CDC autism figures in a rhetorically aggressive and scientifically dubious event that prioritized political theater over evidence-based public health leadership. Throughout the briefing, Kennedy presented autism as an escalating epidemic caused primarily by unspecified environmental toxins, rejecting the broader scientific consensus that autism arises from a complex interplay of genetic and environmental factors. He drew stark comparisons between historical autism prevalence and today's rates, but these comparisons were misleading, failing to account for significant shifts in diagnostic criteria, increased public awareness and broader screening protocols. By implying that earlier generations of doctors and educators simply did not miss cases, Kennedy ignored the long history of underdiagnosis, misclassification and societal stigma, particularly in minority and underserved populations. The language used was highly emotional and often stigmatizing, portraying autistic individuals, especially those with high support needs, as tragic victims of environmental poisoning. Kennedy described them as children who will never write a poem or go out on a date, reinforcing outdated and ableist stereotypes that paint autism as a loss rather than a neurological variation. He repeatedly dismissed research on genetic factors as a distraction or dead end, falsely presenting a binary choice between genes and toxins, and failing to acknowledge the complex synergy between the two. His reference to genes not causing epidemics is a rhetorical sleight of hand that ignores how genetic predisposition interacts with changing environmental and diagnostic landscapes. Moreover, Kennedy's narrative casts public health institutions, the media and industry as complicit in a cover-up. He accused unnamed profiteers of poisoning children for financial gain and the press of aiding this effort through what he called epidemic denial. This conspiratorial framing undermines scientific integrity and promotes distrust in public health agencies. Kennedy also made promises to identify the precise environmental culprits behind autism by September, an implausibly ambitious timeline that leans on vague references to artificial intelligence, digitized health records and a few hand-picked researchers, rather than the rigorous long-term processes required for credible scientific breakthroughs. His willingness to dismiss CDC conclusions and long-standing research on autism genetics while elevating anecdotal claims and outdated studies reflects a troubling anti-scientific posture. The spectacle culminated in Kennedy presenting himself as the lone truth-teller in a sea of censorship and denial, ignoring the fact that he now heads the very institution he once lambasted. In short, the event was less a responsible press briefing than a populist crusade, driven by fear-mongering, anecdotal evidence and ideological zeal, with profound implications for disability policy, research funding and scientific discourse under his leadership at the Department of Health and Human Services. A federal judge, James Boasberg, has found probable cause to believe the Trump administration acted in contempt of court when it failed to comply with his order to return 2 U.S. government flights carrying over 200 alleged Venezuelan gang members of Tren de Aragua, back to the United States after their deportation to El Salvador. The administration had relied on the Alien Enemies Act, labeling the gang a hybrid criminal state, to justify the expedited removals with little due process. However, Boasberg had issued a temporary restraining order, TRO, barring the deportations and ordering the return of the individuals. Despite this, the deportations proceeded, with the administration arguing that Boasberg's oral instructions were defective and his later written order unenforceable. Boasberg strongly rejected these justifications, criticizing the government's willful disregard of court authority and accusing officials of undermining the Constitution. He warned that tolerating such disobedience from executive officials would make a solemn mockery of judicial power. Although the Supreme Court later vacated Boasberg's order in a 5-4 ruling, allowing removals to resume under the Alien Enemies Act, Boasberg maintained that his TRO was in effect for 3 weeks, and the administration willfully defied it during that period. He ordered the administration to file a declaration explaining how it would comply and offered them the chance to purge the contempt by asserting custody over the deported individuals to allow them to pursue habeas corpus claims. If the administration fails to comply, Boasberg said he will move forward with identifying the responsible officials and potentially appoint an independent prosecutor to handle the contempt charges. Meanwhile, ACLU lawyers representing the deported individuals have asked Boasberg to keep jurisdiction over the case and to require the government to provide at least 30 days' notice before any future deportations under the Alien Enemies Act. They are also preparing to refile over 100 habeas petitions on behalf of those removed. Source: ABC News. California has filed a federal lawsuit to block President Trump's sweeping tariffs, arguing he exceeded his authority and caused economic harm. The state contends that Trump's use of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to justify 10% tariffs on all imports, and a 145% tariff on China, is legally unsound, as the law doesn't permit the president to impose broad economic measures without congressional approval or evidence of an unusual and extraordinary threat. The lawsuit claims these tariffs destabilized financial markets, deterred investment and risked a recession. As the largest importer among U.S. states, California argues it suffers disproportionately. Its ports handle 40% of the nation's goods, and its $23.6 billion agricultural export sector is vulnerable to retaliatory tariffs, especially from China. The tariffs, it says, could cost thousands of jobs and vital tax revenue. Governor Gavin Newsom and Attorney General Rob Bonta filed the suit in San Francisco to bar federal agencies from enforcing the tariffs. Through spokesperson Kush Desai, the Trump administration dismissed the lawsuit as political posturing and defended the tariffs as necessary to combat a national emergency stemming from trade deficits and foreign dependency. California's suit joins 3 others challenging Trump's tariff regime, and legal experts say his reliance on the IEEPA is questionable. They argue that long-standing trade imbalances and industrial decline don't meet the statutory threshold for emergency powers, making Trump's actions vulnerable to judicial reversal. Source: Reuters. The Trump administration plans to ask Congress to rescind $1.1 billion in funding for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting (CPB), effectively cutting 2 years' worth of financial support for PBS and NPR. The White House claims that taxpayer funding of what it calls biased content on NPR and PBS is wasteful. Budget Director Russell Vought accused the networks of long-standing leftist reporting and recent cultural indoctrination. Federal CPB funding accounts for about 13% of local public media revenue but plays a disproportionately larger role in sustaining smaller and rural stations. PBS CEO Paula Kerger warned that the proposed cut would severely impact those communities. The move follows recent congressional testimony by Kerger and NPR CEO Catherine Marr on the importance of public broadcasting and its efficiency. Source: PBS. The Justice Department has filed a lawsuit against the state of Maine over its policy allowing transgender student athletes to participate in girls' and women's school sports. While framed as a defense of Title IX, the administration's effort appears less concerned with protecting female athletes than with leveraging federal power to enforce a rigid definition of gender across all states, regardless of local laws or individual circumstances. Attorney General Pam Bondi's claim that Maine is discriminating against women by allowing transgender athletes to compete in alignment with their gender identity is rooted in a selective reading of Title IX. The law prohibits sex-based discrimination, but it does not explicitly forbid transgender participation in sports, an area still debated in courts and among legal scholars. The administration's stance effectively reinterprets the statute to exclude transgender girls and women from competition, equating inclusion with harm despite the limited data provided. With only 2 transgender athletes currently competing in girls' high school sports in Maine, the sweeping nature of the lawsuit seems disproportionate and politically motivated. The lawsuits cited examples, such as a transgender runner outperforming female competitors, are anecdotal and ignore the complex realities of athletic performance, training, and individual variability. These examples serve more as rhetorical devices than legal arguments. The administration's framing reduces transgender youth to political scapegoats while ignoring broader educational and civil rights considerations. Governor Janet Mills is right to characterize the DOJ's actions as an unprecedented intrusion on state authority. Her assertion that the conflict is about states' rights and not just school sports highlights the broader implications. This lawsuit is part of a pattern in which the Trump administration seeks to override state laws under the guise of protecting fairness. The Maine Principals Association, in choosing to follow state law, reflects an understanding of its legal obligations under the Maine Human Rights Act, obligations the federal government is now attempting to nullify through economic coercion. The administration's threat to strip federal education and agriculture funding from Maine is punitive and potentially devastating to the very students it purports to protect. This use of federal power to enforce ideological conformity raises serious concerns about the erosion of federalism and the weaponization of civil rights law. In short, the DOJ lawsuit reflects less a principled defense of women's sports than a top-down attempt to impose a restrictive national policy on gender, regardless of legal precedent, state law, or educational impact.
Source: NPR.